This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. You can join our conversation on our website, wnpr.org/The Wheelhouse. And today we're on Facebook Live at WNPR Wheelhouse. We're joined, as always, to talk about the week's news with Colin McEnroe, host of The Colin McEnroe Show here on Connecticut Public Radio. Howdy, Colin.
Good morning, John. Still working on my Ned Lamont impersonation.
You're doing okay with it.
I'm not as good as you, though.
You're working it out.
Get the definitive one.
Max Reese is here as well. He's political reporter for NBC Connecticut. Hey, Max, how you doing?
Hey, I'm great, John. Good morning.
And Daniela Altamari, State House reporter for the Hartford Courant. Hello there, Daniela.
Hi.
So a week ago today, as he was sworn into office, Governor Ned Lamont doled out some praise and some thank yous to a bunch of people. But there's one person in the crowd who was singled out for some seemingly good-natured ribbing. Denise Merrill, who was, as the Secretary of the State, is Connecticut's top voting and elections official. Here's Lamont from his first of two speeches last week.
On Election Day, thousands of voters lined up, often waiting hours in the pouring rain. By the way, Denise, we're going to do something to speed up voting in this state. Come on. But they waited in the pouring rain because they believed and they knew that their vote can make a difference.
All right, well, Denise Merrill didn't take too long to pitch a solution to those long lines. Here she is at a press conference yesterday morning.
We're proud of how many people voted in Connecticut in November, but there were long lines in some places. And everyone looked at that with dismay. That's why we're here today, because it is time that Connecticut join those 38 other states and have some form of early voting for our residents. It will take the pressure valve off of Election Day.
All right, so Colin, is Connecticut ready to join those 38 other states and finally get into, I guess, the latter half of the 20th century with early voting?
Right. I mean, it's even worse than that because Connecticut doesn't have early voting, nor does it have so-called no excuses absentee ballot voting. So, I mean, now we're in an even smaller minority. Yeah. And yes, absolutely, we need to do early voting. But I have to say this. I hate to be the skunk at the garden party. Actually, I love being the skunk at the garden party. But the problem, part of the problem is we need a reform like early voting. But what's going to happen if we get early voting? Well, early voting is going to be handed over to 169 towns, all with voting officials who have decision-making power.
Cue the Benny Hill music.
Yeah. So that's going to be a problem. I mean, part of the problem that we have right now is, we dumped 1.3 million voters into a pipeline that was not ready to handle that many. I don't really know how many it is ready to handle. But it's more complicated than that because, there were towns that didn't have voting problems. It's okay, I'm going to be like Keith Fanoff. I'm going to do a very complicated analogy. Imagine a laundromat where, 1/9 of the machines didn't work. Well, keeping the laundromat open more hours sort of solves the problem. But, I mean, really, you should fix the machines that don't work. And then imagine a laundromat where nobody's clothes could get clean if anybody's clothes couldn't get clean. And that's the problem with the state of Connecticut, right? We're only as good at the end of election night in terms of confidence in the election results. We're only as good as the worst performers, the worst operators of the system can, in fact, cripple the whole system if in fact, their problems are big enough so that you don't have confidence in the totals in a really close vote. So I'm all in favor of early voting, but I think as long as we're doing that, let's take a look at this system, which is it's going to, in fact, dysfunction. And if it dysfunctions, I mean, for example, this year there were some notable places that had problems, but one of them was Terryville, which is where our producer Scott Breedy lives. And I don't even know whether Terryville is part of Plymouth or Plymouth's part of Terryville. I don't care either. And I don't even know what went wrong in Terryville or why they had 1 hour waits to vote.
Well, they vote at the laundromat, actually. It's an odd system.
With a broken machine there.
Please continue.
If Terryville screws up, and if they screw up at a large level, or next time it won't be Terryville, it'll be someplace else. If you don't address that problem, early voting is only going to be able to do so much.
Max?
I agree with everything that Colin said, especially the laundromat example. But
a terrible analogy.
Whether
tortured is
what I'm about to say is going to come off as a giant attack on 169 cities and towns. But I'm saying this from someone who's covered politics and voting all over the United States of America. The way Connecticut does it is wrong. Period. Stop. The way this state does elections is fundamentally incorrect. 169 cities and towns with more than one election official. So you're talking about basically 345 people who do this because you also have some working families parties in there. It doesn't make sense. Yes, that makes the decentralization of it makes it more secure. The fact it's all on paper makes it more secure. All those are good things. There are counties across this great country of ours where there are 3 people in charge of voting for 200,000 people, and they somehow manage to make it work at a much more lean cost, and they just do it. As far as the early voting issue goes, so first of all, I agree. If you're going to talk about early voting, we need to talk about a wholesale change to the way it's done on a local level. Second of all, I don't. It's very hard to come up with arguments against this early voting proposal that are rational and reasonable. Vermont has 45 days of early voting. Maine has 30 to 45, which is I found funny. It depends on when the absentee ballots are ready. There's nothing standardized on that in Maine. Massachusetts has an 11-day window, and New York on Tuesday just approved a 10-day early voting window. Everyone's doing it. And yesterday we heard from Republicans, and they were saying that it was Len Fasano who said that he wants to make sure that any system is protected from fraud. I think everybody agrees with that, no doubt. But early voting clearly is helping Republicans all over the country. This, I think, helps everybody. I also don't think it's going to increase turnout. I think it's just going to make it easier to vote. So those are some of my thoughts on this.
I wonder, and I haven't looked at this, but I wonder if one of the quote-unquote reforms that was instituted in the past, this idea of election day, same day registration, was one of the reasons for the lines. I mean, when we look at New Haven, right? All those people showed up to vote; they weren't registered, so that's part of the quote unquote problem. But it was also part of the solution, making voting more accessible to people. So it's a balance, I guess, right? I mean,
Connecticut is really good these days. Is a sort of a leader in getting people to register to vote. I mean, I think. Pretty soon you're going to be able to register to vote just by going to like a Huskies basketball game or something, But then, you got all these people who are now eligible to vote, and you haven't fixed the pipeline you're dumping them into.
And it's a good question. Well, what happens to same day election voting if you're going to have like a 3-week window? Because then what you're kind of inviting still are those lines if you still have same day election, but Denise Merrill makes a good phrase of the pressure valve. You're relieving that pressure if you have 2-3 weeks to vote.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you alluded to New York State. I mean, they like you mentioned just a couple days ago, they passed all these reforms, including automatic registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. I mean, they went from way in the back of the pack to with this legislation way in the front in terms of accessibility to voting.
So then, Daniela, what's the mechanism for this to actually happen? Obviously, there are going to be some questions from the Republican side. There'll probably be a lot of other questions from people who are just traditionalists who believe that Connecticut can continue to do things the way that we've done them for however many years. So what happens next?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there will be criticism, as Max just alluded to. I mean, people will wonder: is this the best way? Is this is this really going to open up the system, or is it going to do what the same day registration did, create a different set of problems?
One thing I would just quickly say is to get this requires a constitutional amendment. I can't remember whether we've said this or not. So that's I think 114 votes in the House, 27 votes in the Senate. So you kind of need a little bit of a tiny sliver of Republican buy-in probably to do this. But I also think that Eric Simowitz and Matt Ritter, the two leaders of the House, they've said there's going to be early voting on early voting. They're going to tackle this at some time other than 11:55 on the last night of the session. So, and I think there's a little bit of I could be wrong about this, but I feel like there's a little bit of a thing in the air. Like, yes, let's really be effective this time. People have higher expectations of us. A lot of people voted in the last election. They took a real interest in how the state is being operated. They care about their right to vote. So let's actually get something done as opposed to just shoving the shuffleboard puck back and forth until the last night of the session.
So that's what it takes. We get interested and engaged, Max, and then all of a sudden they start to think maybe we should do something this time.
You don't say. I think it's weird. There's like an odd giddiness at the Capitol. I think some people are really excited. They're happy. And look, if there's an issue that you could probably move forward that would probably have some Republican support quickly, it'd probably be early voting. It's technical and it's legalese, but you basically need 75% in the House and Senate, just like Colin was alluding to get it on the ballot for 2020.
Yeah.
If that doesn't happen, you need another vote of the next General Assembly in 2021, which gets on the ballot in 2022, right?
Yeah, you can do it two majority votes of the legislature.
It's going to happen no matter when.
But
really.
But important for people to understand, under that scenario, we don't end up with early voting in the very important 2020 presidential election race. And I think that's the thing that people are kind of looking at is we're going to start in our system in Connecticut, we're going to start to solve these problems and push the football a little bit further down the field. But that doesn't mean that in probably the most closely watched, most highly attended election of all time in history, in 2020, we're not going to have it in place.
This is why Connecticut's such a great place. The land of steady habits isn't just a slogan. It is enshrined in our Constitution, folks. We got to take time to do these things.
Daniela, one question I have is, I think there is this kind of can-do spirit here in the air. It's mid-January, so I don't know. I was even thinking when Ned Lamont gave his inaugural address, and he said, well, first of all, let's balance the damn budget. And I'm guessing the legislators are all just smacking their foreheads thinking, why didn't we think of that? I'm kind of wondering, you talk to more legislators than I do. I'm wondering, it's, I guess, easy maybe to have that kind of attitude on Inauguration Day and a week or two after. Do you sense that there is like this renewed sense of purpose, or are they going to go back to the old ways?
They could very easily squander it as they've done in the past. New administration, they always come in with some goodwill, right? So we're going to work together. But 2 years ago, when we had the Republicans having parity in the Senate and strong numbers in the House, it was going to be all bipartisanship. We're going to work together, and we saw how that worked out with the budget. So dragging on until October. It's hard to know what's real and what's talking points.
One of the things that we always talk about, and we think it would be great if our state lawmakers would take up tighter campaign finance rules, maybe change things about the way that the rest of the system works, because yes, we can vote early, but maybe we aren't getting the elections that we exactly asked for. The SEC's proposed 8 major pieces of legislation. I'm reading from Ken Dixit here in Hearst, Connecticut Media. Increasing public disclosure, even providing additional money for candidates who become targets of big PACs. The agency would like the legislature to revisit a law approved last year that limits SEC investigations to 1 year. Max, any hope that we see some big changes around campaign finance reform this time around?
It is. Look, if there's anything that's going to get as political as possible, it's going to be changes to campaign finance. The irony of it is that Republicans, arguably, despite the November result, have been the biggest beneficiary of the Citizens Election Program, the Clean Election Program. The changes to it, though, it's so hard to see where those fall in a hierarchy. The Speaker of the House isn't really talking about it. Republicans also not really talking about it that much. And also, you have Ned Lamont. He didn't use the Clean Election Program. He just used his own money. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to see where any rallying cry would come around it because also because of the governor's race, there has to be some kind of a change, but you don't know what the change looks like. And is the General Assembly really equipped to make the changes, considering none of them are governor? I don't mean that flippantly. I mean it seriously.
Yeah, and I don't know, Danielle. We just saw a governor elected who financed his own campaign. Again, it's not really what we asked for some years ago when we were looking at changing the way Connecticut government works. We kept rolling out people who were trying to self-finance, whether for Senate races or for governor's races, and eventually one of them took hold. And now, I don't know, is now the time to be talking about changing the rules again to maybe make it a little bit more of an even playing field?
Maybe, but, it's also for, the progressive groups that want to see these changes, not SEEK, but, other sort of good government advocates. They've got a whole host of other things that they're pushing, and it's all, like everything, it's a matter of priorities, so.
Yeah. And is it a priority, Colin?
I doubt it. It's really, the legislature is really weird. It was really hard to get them to convert to public financing. They were very nervous about it. They were reluctant to do it. It was hard to get leadership to get behind it. Now that they've got it, I think they're going to be very reluctant to give it up. And I'm not suggesting anyway. I don't think anybody's suggesting that they give it up. Although when you look at how many things are wrong with the system, once again, there's that question: do you burn the thing to the ground and build it all up all over again, or do you take a wrench to it? One thing that I would note is that although I often say on the show that Dan Malloy gets a bad rap for certain stuff, one thing that he did, one of his first acts as governor, was to take a wrench and loosen all the nuts on the system in terms of allowing larger contribution limits and more money to State Central. And the architect of that was his then staffer, Luke Bronin, who went in and kind of redlined the clean election law in a way that made it, I thought, somewhat less effective. I think there's some things that might work in strengthening elections enforcement, or SEEK, as that's the acronym that Daniela just used. I think that's a good idea. I think SEEK should have a lot of power, and I think they should be able to get involved with more than one investigation per year, or whatever the limit is right now. I don't think you're going to find a lot of public support, or for that matter right now anyway, support from me for the idea of giving people larger grants if they're facing a lot of PAC money. That just seems like, I mean, we went through that with Malloy's first campaign. Remember when they went back to the legislature and gave him more money because Foley had so much money? You just can't. That's an arms race you can't get into.
Another way in which maybe this system is up for a little bit of debate, our friend Kevin Rennie has talked about it on this show. He's written about it in the Hartford Courant. You know, Max, the idea that Ned Lamont has now appointed a whole bunch of people who just got voted in and used citizens' election money to get voted in.
Kevin Rennie makes a great point. He really does. Of that, you got Terry Geritana, Beth Bye, and Tim Larson. They all use the Citizens Elections Program. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars of all of our money. And then they don't get sworn in. They take jobs in administration. And there's nothing in the law that prevents them from doing this, that requires that money to get paid back in any way. That's 10 points, Kevin Rennie. That is an incredible point. And this is one of those things where, you know, Danielle and I, because we're in it every day, this is the minutia of state government. A lot of people don't notice it, but that's a big problem. It is your money out there, folks.
Yeah, a lot of money, and then a whole lot of special elections. Those special elections cost a whole lot of money, and on it goes. And that seems to be not, again, how we're supposed to be spending the money that goes into the Citizens Election Fund.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Republicans will say. We can't afford this. You know, the state has some budget problems, and, you know, this is spending money on elections and letting people get appointed to jobs and then spending money on more elections. Might not be the way to go.
Well, but before we break, I should
say one thing
go
about
ahead, please
column?
do.
I thought it was a really, really great column too, and it was the kind of column that people on the left and people on the right looked at it and said,
Absolutely.
he's 100% right. And I do think at minimum, I'm one of the 30,000 or so people who really like Beth Bye and I voted for Beth Bye to be my state senator. It was never mentioned to me that she was in the market for a full-time job and might never serve one day of that term. I was under the impression that's what she wanted. And I do feel like a covenant is broken there. And yeah, she got a $95,000 or whatever grant to run her campaign. I think at minimum, we as journalists in the next election cycles are going to at least have to get people, we're going to have to ask all these candidates, are you committed to serving your term?
It's now a standard question.
Yeah.
It's a standard question now. Are you going to serve your term? And also, you know, Chris Soto, it's another one. He ran unopposed and now works in the Lamont administration.
I totally get that. But what you'd hear from the candidate is yes.
Of
and then what
course.
you'd hear when the governor asks, will you serve? The answer would be yes, of course. And there'd be no way to do anything about that.
So I know we're going to take it, but I'll give a little example. I'll pre-write a script. Pre-writing a story is not anything that's uncommon in journalism. And I would write, like in parentheses, on these stories, I can serve my district as well from inside the administration as I can actually serve in the district. That's the same line you get from everyone, Republican or Democrat. It doesn't matter. That's what they're going to say every time, whether it's true or not.
Okay, two quick other election things just to take your temperature on this, whether or not these two things come up. One has to do with something we've talked an awful lot about, whether or not we're going to change the rules about conventions for state parties, because conventions, especially on the Republican side, didn't exactly this time around work all that terribly well, Daniela. Is there a sense that maybe the conventions go away, that the parties are going to think about running this an entirely different way than they have in the past?
Sure. I mean, there's talk of that, as you point out, especially with the Republicans. It was a messy and long convention with many, many candidates. And in the end, Bob Stefanowski was nominated. Mark Boughton was nominated. And they had a primary, more messy process, more of a messy process with more candidates. And the convention endorsed candidate did not win.
The guy who didn't attend the convention won.
Exactly. One of the guys who didn't attend the convention.
Yeah, and so I mean I don't know how far this actually goes, Max, because the next logical step then, of course, is open primaries, which is maybe a step too far for Stagio, Connecticut.
Well, remember that thing I said about how 169 cities and towns running elections doesn't make sense? This convention thing, get rid of that too. That also doesn't make sense. Stop it, people. It clearly doesn't work the way it was intended to in the 1920s and 30s. you got to move the primary back. You got to move it closer to the springtime, and you got to put in a runoff. Is my position on this. You got 5 Republicans running for this. The guy who won with 31% of the vote. Is that what it was? I think. All right, so that means almost 70% of registered Republicans who voted in this thing, they're basically ignored, and they were like, well, I guess we're going to deal with Bob, and ended up being, I think, a better candidate than some people gave him credit for, but. That's not the system you want. Have a primary in June, then have a runoff in August, and then do it that way. That's something that I would say.
Am I hallucinating that Chris Murphy said something like this might be our last convention or something? I feel like Murphy at some point
He was on the record with something like that. I don't remember what it was.
That idea.
Yeah.
So that's some support on the Democratic side. I don't think. It's not a good system. I think it's going to be a hard system to get rid of. It's a system that kind of allows people to feel important and they show up. But I'll just quickly say, if you want to see the worst example of it, let's go back to Kevin's column again. What's going to happen now, what is happening this weekend is the conventions that picked all of those 5 legislators who've gotten jobs in the administration and any other special elections that have to happen, like if Derek Slapp, who's a state rep, wins Beth Bai's seat, then there's another special election. But the way that the nominees will be picked will be by the sort of little mini conventions that pick the original nominee. There's no opportunity for a primary at all. This is the convention system at its worst. A bunch of hand-picked insiders deciding who the nominee is. It's another reason why this shouldn't happen.
Okay, you said runoff real quick, Max. Any chance that we talk about ranked choice voting this time around?
I don't think so.
No ranked choice voting, Daniela?
I doubt it.
Because so in Maine, they've actually gone to this. It's gone through quite a few struggles. It was only in place for the federal election. It couldn't actually get through the legislature in a way that allowed it to be used for the gubernatorial election. And it resulted in Maine calling it in a runoff. And the Republican who had that seat lost to a Democrat. In some ways, people say that's how it was supposed to work. Essentially, what it allows you to do is pick your candidates in order of preference, which then gets away from the problem that Max was talking about in which people don't have their voices heard.
I think of ranked choice voting. Every time I think of ranked choice voting, I think of Carmen Baskoff, who's a producer on Where We Live. It's really popular with smart young people, and they look at it and they go, wow, this really makes total sense to me. I think it's a long way off. My plan is to listen to the excellent radio show Next and see what other New England states do and what kind of problems they have. Right now, though, we're still in driver's ed here in Connecticut where we're learning to accelerate and brake in terms of elections. Really fancy kinds of parallel parking, that's way in our future. We're not going to do ranked choice voting. We have enough trouble certifying election results in a way that's persuasive to the populace.
We're going to have to put one of those big signs on the back of our state. Exactly. Student driver. And New York's behind us beeping their horn. We're talking with Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR, Danielle Altamari, State House reporter at the Hartford Courant, Max Reese, political reporter for NBC Connecticut. We're also on Facebook Live today, and we're in the wheelhouse talking about the week's news. When we come back, we're going to be talking about what's happening around the government shutdown here in Connecticut. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're talking about the week's news with Daniela Altamari, State House reporter at the Hartford Courant, Max Reese, political reporter for NBC Connecticut, and also our own Colin McEnroe. Colin, what's on your show today?
We are going to be re-airing a show that we feel like a lot of people didn't hear because when it ran, Noah Behrman, who's a wonderful jazz pianist and well known to you, John, composed an album based on the myth of Sisyphus that addressed his own problems, a medical condition that really affects his ability to play the piano, which is what he does, but also the murder of one of his friends and musical colleagues. And so we spent a whole show just going through that album with Noah and talking about the stories behind it.
I'm so glad you're playing that again. Really a thoughtful conversation and great music, too. So that's on the Colin McEnroe Show today, 1 o'clock. A few things to plug quickly. If you're really, really into conversations about the state budget, about what's happening in Hartford and in Washington, and I know you must be because you're listening here or watching on Facebook Live, our own Vanessa De La Torre, Mark Pazniokis from the Connecticut Mirror, and Dan Haar from Hearst Connecticut Media are all on the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government's Stories Behind the Biggest Stories of 2018 panel. It's the third annual event, Wednesday, January 23rd from 5:30 to 7 p.m. at the Lyceum in Hartford. The Connecticut Foundation for Open Government is otherwise known as CFOG, and should be a really interesting event with some of our Wheelhouse regulars. Again, coming up at the Lyceum, 5:30 in Hartford on Wednesday, January 23rd. And if you don't have enough wheelhouse type stuff this morning, you can cut right over to Facebook Live with ctnewsjunkie.com. Christine Stewart, our friend, is hosting an event called The Squeeze is on the next state budget, and she's going to be talking to some insiders about what's happening with the state budget this time around. That's happening on Facebook Live at ctnewsjunkie.com. So plugs out of the way. Let's turn to the 26th day that the federal government has been partially shut down. That's the longest shutdown ever. In Connecticut, that means essential air traffic controllers and Transportation Security Administration workers, as well as members of the Coast Guard, people who work from the EPA. A lot of people are working without pay. They can't collect unemployment because they're still working. It's a big problem. So Governor Ned Lamont last night devised a plan to help them. Here he is at a pretty hastily arranged press conference to announce a joint effort with Webster Bank to provide them with state-backed loans as a stopgap measure.
We're going to be working with the legislature as quickly as we can, perhaps as early as tomorrow. But this is the way that I can take care of people right now who are having a hard time paying their bills, having a hard time putting food on the table, having a hard time meeting the mortgage payment. This is why you have government. We can step up and make a difference here. When I can do it with the private sector, all the better.
So, Max, you were there last night as Ned Lamont rolled this out. I mean, the details look something like about 1,500 people might be eligible for this, and it's a zero-interest loan from Webster Bank, and the state says that they're backing those loans in the sense that they're going to make sure everyone repays them.
Yeah, and we spoke about this off mic. This is a very low exposure move by the state and by Webster Bank. So low exposure means low risk, means really it's kind of good politics for everybody here. The Lamont administration gets to say, look, this is how we're helping federal workers. And by the way, it's kind of an outside the box thinking, right? I mean, you're using private capital to provide extra cash to federal workers who, by the way, are not eligible for any kind of unemployment because they're not unemployed. They have jobs, just not getting paid to do them. It's an interesting move. He has to have conversation with the General Assembly because the governor can't just appropriate funds. In this case, like about $5 million would be the cap for the pay period or something like that. But look, it makes a lot of sense. They know that exactly how much each of these federal workers are going to get paid. So the exposure, like I said, is really, really low. And everyone gets to say, look, we're trying to do a good thing here.
I want to get deeper into how this shutdown is affecting people in Connecticut. But I don't know, Daniela, when you see this last night, does this hint at a little bit of what Ned Lamont has been talking about his governing style, what he wants to bring to the state? He's talked an awful lot about how we can get private business involved in various ways. This seems like a low bar of entry way to do it, but it is kind of, cashing in on an election promise. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's right in his groove there. He's the business guy, and he's going to work with the business community to improve things in the state. I mean, I think this is just for the essential workers, right, who have to report to work, can't collect unemployment, unlike the non-essential workers. So these are the prison guards at the prison in Danbury, and some of the the Coast Guard folks and people who perform key tasks for the government. I mean, nobody wants the prisons to not be protected, but yet they're not getting paid. So this is a way for the governor to sort of work with private industry and do kind of what he does.
I think it's even more than that. I mean, he's sort of like another Ned Flanders, right? No problem at Diddley-o, Homer. You can borrow my rake. I mean, and there is like a little there's a little quality of that. And I'm joking, but I think it's really good. I mean, I'm back to that sort of, we could do something. Like it's not a big thing, but as Max says, it's a little bit out of the box. As Daniela says, it actually really does matter. Yeah. And it's a thing we can do. And we're going to do it right now. We're not going to talk about it for 3 weeks and do it. We're going to do it right now. I'm going to go find some bank that will do this with me. And I'm sure there are going to be some problems down the line, and maybe some other banks are going to wonder why they got cut out of this great PR opportunity. I don't know. But really, that idea of the citizens expect us to do stuff about problems, I'm going to do something right now.
All I could think about, though, Max, last night was, Ned Lamont perhaps sitting down with, say, Aetna or the Hartford or any number of other big employers in the state that we often talk about how they're going to help to give back in some of the problems and maybe restructure a better health care deal for the state. I mean, those things are much more complicated than some loans that will almost undoubtedly be paid back at zero interest by a local bank to 1,500 people. The big systemic stuff, when you start to tackle that with private industry, it gets a lot more hairy.
You are dead on the money with that. But to Lamont's credit, he's been on the job at this point for 6 days and is already able to parade out, look, this is something I've done. Here it is. But you're right, it's a layup. At the end of the day, it's not a hard thing to do, but it took some creativity. And what we don't know is, was it Webster's idea? Was the Banking Association's idea? Or was it Ned Lamont and his administration idea? We don't quite know the answer to that. But he gets to say, look, here's what I did. And we're only about a month away from his budget address. So maybe it's a precursor. Maybe, hopefully, of some outside-the-box thinking.
Did you have a thought, Colin?
No, I'm still thinking. He's setting a really great tone. And you tackle a little problem because, as you guys are saying, the big problems are going to be really, really hard, and he's going to burn some goodwill up at that time. Right now, he's doing stuff where he's just banking goodwill.
Well, what's the alternative, right? He could pound his fist on the table and say, Donald Trump, open up the government right now, and then not do anything about it. He's doing something about
it.
Hey,
diddly ho, Mr. President.
I think Blumenthal and Murphy were talking about some changes to enable those essential workers to collect unemployment, which probably would have come at some cost to the state as opposed to this approach. So.
But before we move on to another topic, Max, you've also been covering the larger impact of the government shutdown here. We've already laid out who the types of workers here who are harmed. As we go into more weeks of this, no negotiations happening in Washington whatsoever. What's happening? Who's really being hurt? And what sort of impacts will we see the longer this goes on?
So it's, we were up at Bradley Airport the other day. You go to any airport we've got 2 with TSA agents in Connecticut, but anyone in the country, the TSA agents are not getting paid. They're working and they're not getting paid. The people who are landing airplanes for us, both the air traffic controllers, but also their transportation safety personnel as well, also not getting paid. They're federal, either contractors or federal direct employees. So to say these are vital personnel is an understatement, especially on the air traffic controller side. And one of the anecdotes of this, we spoke to a young man up at the airport. He's a Zamboni driver on the side. That's a job he does to make money. And I asked him, did you ever think your Zamboni driving job would subsidize your federal job helping land airplanes? And he goes, of course not. That's where we're at with this, a level that none of us ever thought we would get to.
And it is a level, we've been sort of joking about it off air, Colin, but at a certain point, as you don't have food inspected, as you don't have airplanes being checked properly, you start to worry about the overall infrastructure of the country, the things that keep us safe and keep the economy moving.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the Tourism Bureau of Norway to say, maybe not such a good time to visit this place. It's not safe now. Planes are not safe. Food is not safe. Stay home. And really, I think there's been a reluctance to talk about how serious the problem is because I think if we really, the Pilots Association, said, look, this is a real problem. You got to fix it. I think if you don't want to get into scare tactics that are going to ultimately cause the markets to go nuts and stuff like that. So people have been a little bit careful. But the truth is, it is increasingly a dangerous situation. Right now, it is some percent less safe to fly than it was a month and a half ago. We just don't know what that percent is. And maybe knowing that percent is both a good thing if you want to be safer and a bad thing if you don't want panic to rule our nation.
Let's turn to how the new progressive movement that has occupied a certain percentage of Congress and also the legislature of places like Connecticut is forcing some changes within the Democratic Party, and also how a lot of that enthusiasm is being expressed in events like the upcoming Women's March this Saturday. Danielle, I want to start with you to talk about that. The Women's March started as a gigantic outpouring of a lot of people who feel very strongly about a lot of different issues in the wake of Donald Trump's inauguration a few years ago. Now, a few years on, it's maybe taking a little bit different tone. It probably has an awful lot more to do with trying to find a way to defeat Donald Trump. But as we heard this morning on NPR, there are some divisions within the groups of marchers about what they should be focusing on. What should we expect from this big event coming up not only in Washington, but in other places around the country this weekend? Yeah,
there'll be a march in Hartford as well as you pointed out, cities across the country and I believe across the world. The movement is definitely very divided. There was an article about a month ago in Tablet magazine that really laid out some of those divisions regarding the leadership of the national women's movement. The Connecticut group and other groups don't have a super close affiliation with the national group, but there are, a lot of important and tough conversations that are happening regarding, anti-Semitism and the role of women of color and, some of these other issues that have really sort of torn this movement, if not torn it apart, certainly have impacted it. It's also hard 2 years out to sort of maintain that momentum. I mean, that march on Inauguration Day or the day after Inauguration Day in 2017 was extraordinary. And it was amazing to see those photos from Washington and to see the crowds, in Hartford and everywhere else. It's difficult, obviously, to sustain that 2 years out. We're sort of at the midpoint, perhaps, of the Trump presidency. People's sort of level of resistance in some ways might be stronger than ever. But in other ways, some people that you talk to are just worn down. So all of that to say is who knows what kind of a turnout there'll be. The National Women's March did sort of try to address some of these issues. They appointed a new steering committee. They have different members, including 3 prominent Jewish women who were appointed to this group to try to address some of these issues. But whether it will impact the turnout, I guess we'll see on Saturday.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I heard about the march this morning on Morning Edition on NPR was, Max, that one of the animating features of the first march is that people under a very, very big tent with an awful lot of things that they care most deeply about could come together in one place. But to me, in many ways, that feels like, let's say, the Occupy movement, a lot of the other marches that happened in the wake of the Iraq War, in which there's this kind of diffuse sense that we are for some things and we are against some things, but there's not a clear path as to what we are asking for very, very specifically. And I'm not sure if this movement has maybe focused itself a little bit more with 2020 coming up, or whether or not it's a bit more diffuse than it could be.
I definitely see a lot more organization than the Occupy movement, because with the Occupy, it kind of felt like a gelatinous mass of different things popping up that looked like each other. Whereas with Women's March, it's interesting. They have coordinated media events. They have people speaking on behalf of the group that, by and large, they're okay with that. It kind of feels like, in some respects, the forming of a new political party. And they've already seen some election results. People were actively saying on the campaign trail for both Congress and here in Connecticut, I was actively involved with the Women's March. That was a badge of honor. I have never heard. Occupy was 2011, 2010. Is that, if brain serves correct? I've never heard anyone say, oh, well, I was a part of the Occupy movement. I should run for office. Women's March people have a very different, I think by and large, far more targeted message, which sounds more like a party.
Yeah. Colin?
I mean, I think that's the proof of the pudding, is that 2018 was a pussy hat election. I mean,
parties have growing pains. So I don't mean to cut you off, but
right.
Parties have growing pains.
Yeah, I mean, it was an anti-Trump election. It was a few other things, but it was definitely it'll go down in history as the pussy hat election. It's not a post hoc Proctor hoc fallacy to say they had those marches in 2017. They got a lot of women elected in 2018. They got a lot of women registering to vote. They got high turnout among women in 2018. It was a completely effective movement. Now, as Daniela is suggesting, the worst thing that could happen now is because of either internecine sniping, which to me is letting the perfect become the enemy of the good, or just because it's in January, they should move it to a warmer month, or just because of whatever, they fizzle out, or they have, it would be really, really bad and unfortunate and kind of tragic if they got really, really low turnout, either this year or in any other year. The one thing they want to make sure they do is continue to show at least some level of strength that resembles the 2017 march.
Sorry, go ahead, Danielle.
No, go ahead.
What I was going to say was, what the Women's March is, when you see the photos, especially the one here in Hartford, it's this unbelievably diverse coalition of people. It's older people, it's younger people, it's kids, it's men, it's women, it's Jews, it's Muslims, it's Christians. It's of every single persuasion. They're all right there. that group is not going to get along on every single topic. They're just not. But the fact that they're still look, there's a circular firing squad, it seems like, on every single topic now. Everyone's saying, well, you're not enough of this. By and large, I think the Women's March is for the most part, I think, from my perspective, getting a lot of its message across.
One of the women who came out of that 2018 election is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she has been, ruffling feathers, certainly in Washington. She's been very active on social media. She's been pushing the members of her own party very hard on issues that she feels important. And out from the hinterlands comes a voice that perhaps we've heard again, speaking here on Fox News. Let's see if we can pick up who exactly this is, talking about her role in the party.
We only have two major political parties in America. They have to be big tents if they're going to succeed. So, okay, she got elected to Congress. She's inside the tent now. But I just disagree. She takes us back to a big spending, big taxing Democratic Party.
Colin McEnroe, name that voice.
Make the bad man stop talking. You didn't give us a trigger warning.
I'm sorry about the
You played Joe Lieberman.
Sorry about triggering you.
Trigger warning. Well, this is, he's playing his hits, right? He's been doing this for decades now. I mean, he has opposed any significant progressivism within the Democratic Party. He got primaried by the guy who's the governor of Connecticut now in 2006 because of that. And although it became an election about Iraq, there's a lot of things that Joe Lieberman has stood in the way of that are pretty popular, like right now, like Medicare for all, for example. So, no, he's very much out of tune. Look, there does have to be a conversation and a dialogue within the Democratic Party. Ocasio-Cortez is now emblematic of or symbolic of a kind of progressive who's running maybe getting a little out over her skis some of the time, but that's kind of refreshing to watch. That's good for the party. It's not bad for the party. Joe, you're bad for the party. Go home.
Max, quick thought?
I don't think anyone in California wonders what Barbara Boxer has to say about the Democratic Party, the same way I don't think anybody really cares what Joe Lieberman has to say. By the way, I think same goes for Republicans of 30 years ago in a lot of respects. I don't think anyone's looking for it.
I just have to ask, though, Danielle, remember... This guy was incredibly popular in Connecticut, not only amongst the people who voted for him time and time again for different jobs, but also within the Democratic establishment. I understand that he's burned quite a bit of that goodwill, but it's amazing to think that it's not that long ago that this was the most popular politician in Connecticut state history.
No, it's true, and he's certainly done his best to burn those bridges. But you could say Chris Dodd was popular at one point too. Things change, circumstances change, people change.
I have to ask about one last issue, just because it may come up this week. We'll probably have a lot more to talk about on this in the coming weeks. We've talked about various things that progressives in Hartford might want to push for. Many other states in our region and across the country are pushing for a $15 minimum wage. Daniela, is there any chance that we have more and more talk about this session? Ned Lamont talked about it in his State of the State address.
Yes, it's coming. It'll probably be some type of incremental. It's not going to be $15 an hour on next January 1st. It'll be in steps over the course probably of several years. But yeah, no doubt about it. It'll happen.
So, and what form does that take? Because we've been talking about this for a long time, Max. I remember the governor, the former governor, Malloy, sitting across from me saying, I don't know, $9 an hour, that's going to be really hard to do. Mm-hmm. And then we raised ours again. But are we ready to go to 15?
I don't know if we're ready for it or not, but it's going to happen. You speak with the business interests, you speak with everybody, and everyone is, the business interests appear a little bit resigned to the fact that it's going to happen. But Governor Ned Lamont told me a couple weeks ago that his words were, it's the right thing to do, and we're going to phase it in so everybody doesn't get a surprise.
Yep.
I agree with my fellow panelists. Once again, Lamont is setting the right tone. So Hartford Healthcare and other groups are leading the way in the private sector here, but he's going to make sure that business and government stay in some kind of geosynchronous orbit so that this happens in a way where kind of there's going to be more consensus. There needs to be kind of radical consensus about this, and I think he might have the right strategy to get there.
I went slightly out of order, and I just have to get one last thought from Daniela on this. We were talking about Joe Lieberman, somebody who is not burning bridges, somebody who's still very popular within Connecticut. John Larson sat down with some local progressives. People flooded into his Hartford office. These are people who advocate both at the state level and at the federal level, and sat and talked to John Larson about what they want him to do. How'd that go?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, you're right. John Larson is not Joe Lieberman. He is taking pains to reach out to these sort of new activists. But, still, it was a very top-down event. Larson spoke and people listened. And, Larson joked about how he doesn't use social media. And, it's 2019. Is that okay for a member of Congress? Maybe he should be drinking a beer or, cooking dinner on Instagram.
Or dancing on rooftops.
Getting his teeth cleaned, whatever, But I mean, I think he's sees, in some ways what's happening within the party, and he is not, going to become a Joe Crowley or, somebody who's Mike Capuano who's, cast aside.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to hear from our panelists their feats of strength for this week, or perhaps some of the grievances that they'd like to air. We are hearing from Daniela Altamari from the Hartford Courant, Max Reese from NBC Connecticut, Colin McEnroe from WNPR. This is The Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky, talking about the week's news this week, and we like to finish with feats of strength or perhaps airing of grievances. And we're going to start with Daniela Altamari, State House reporter at the Hartford Courant. What do you got for us this week, Daniela?
I have a sort of inside baseball grievance from inside the Capitol. I could speak for much of the reporting corps when I complain about lengthy and needlessly lengthy press conferences where elected officials each have to say their piece and go on and sort of repeat themselves over and over again and introduce every member of their coalition and just go on and on and on. And it's been increasingly frustrating, I think, for some of us in the press corps to
Danielle,
have to
I just
attend
like to
these
say
events.
that was a great airing of grievances. You're a terrific reporter. Max, you do a wonderful job.
Can we introduce
This
John?
show-
He is a
John, where would we be without John?
I don't know.
This show would be nothing.
Yeah.
That's what these press conferences are like.
Yeah,
exactly right.
They do go on too long. I'm so glad I don't have to be up there and do that anymore. I used to do that all the time, and I was equally annoyed that I'm sure that they've gotten worse over time. Max, how about you?
I have a grievance and a feat of strength.
Okay.
The feat of strength, my son is standing. He's my 1-year-old son is now pulling himself up and standing. It's a feat of strength. And my daughter, we have twins, a boy and a girl. My daughter, who's been doing this for like 5 months, looks at us when we applaud him like, Dad, what's the deal? I've been doing this for months. You never gave me any of this stuff. So she has the grievance. My son has the feat of strength.
Okay. That's very good. Colin?
I want to mention 2 interviews. These
Yes.
are not political interviews that really moved me in certain ways. And one of them is John C. Reilly on Fresh Air yesterday, the actor John C. Reilly. And I haven't heard the whole interview. I'm going to go back and listen to it. But there's like a sweetness about this man that it's a little bit Lamont-like, not to belabor this whole point, but there's a sweetness and an openness about him and the way that he describes his approach and a time when Joaquin Phoenix, who I think we all agree is a little bit nutty, but he berated John C. Reilly on the set about something, and John C. Reilly said, I realized he was right, and the only reason I was doing that was because of fear. I had to lose my fear. And I just thought, I love this man. I love, and then similarly, Conan O'Brien, who has reshaped his late night show and is bringing it back at a half-hour length with a very different kind of format and no dusk and stuff like that. He gave an interview to the New York Times, which is at times very funny, but also a really great explanation by a creative person with a certain amount of courage and a lot of perspective on what his role is, about how as he says, I want to scare myself. I want to do something that isn't comfortable anymore. And I as somebody, you and I, John, we're always trying to figure out, like, how can we do better shows? How can we rethink the paradigm? I found it a very inspiring way that he was thinking about his role.
Interesting. Two feats of strength for me. One, I finally started watching Escape at Dannemora on Showtime last night. And not only, boy, is it good, but you really get a sense of a true life crime story that is well told on screen. And I know some of the people who covered that story, so I do highly recommend
John,
it.
confess your prejudice, too.
We just
when
finished our
they
shows.
opened that with Greg Lake, the soundtrack is like a John Dankosky soundtrack. They opened.
The show starts with Emerson, Lake,
from
and
the
Palmer.
beginning.
That's an entirely different program that we're going to talk about. The other thing I'll quickly say is there's this great podcast from Vermont Public Radio called Brave Little State. A lot of it really has to deal with Vermont, but everyone should check this out because they do a pro and con of heating with wood. This time of year, people are worried about whether or not my wood-burning stove is actually good for the environment or bad for the environment. And this month's episode tells you everything you need to know about whether or not burning wood good is good or bad long term. So that's my feat of strength. Max Reese, thank you very much from NBC Connecticut.
Thank you.
Thanks to Danielle Altamari from the Hartford Courant. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks to Colin McEnroe as well. Thanks to Scott Brady, Kyone Wolf, Katie Tolarski, and Carlos Mejia, and everyone who make the Wheelhouse possible.